Hello and welcome to our history module. Just want to take a minute to say how much we appreciate you purchasing this course. Dr. Russo and I are deeply committed to making cannabis safer and better. And we feel like the more people who have a deep scientific understanding of how and why the plant works in the human body, the better for everyone. And so today we're going to take a look back at the history of cannabis use, specifically in medicine. So I want to take a moment to just say that Dr. Russo gives what I would say is the single most comprehensive overview of how cannabis has been used historically in medicine. I think that you will be amazed at how many use cases he is going to present. And at this point, I want to turn it over to you, Dr. Russo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nisha. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. So, welcome. So, this is our history module. We call this a Cannabis Historical Overview, how it informs modern therapeutics. In this and subsequent presentations, I'll be presenting a lot of historical data. And certainly this introductory lecture is only the beginning of the kind of material that's present, but to give you a little taste and show some correlations to modern scientific evidence. So these are our introductions again that you'll be welcome to study later. Now, the objective of this module is to examine the history of medical use of cannabis and highlight how many ancient claims have subsequently gained scientific support for their veracity. These first mentions should serve as practical guidelines on how medical applications should focus and provide useful guideposts to additional clinical investigations. Our subject, of course, is cannabis sativa, cultivated cannabis, which is food, fuel, fiber, and pharmacy, primarily from the unfertilized female flowering tops. And as we'll learn more about the plant in another module, it's a dioecious plant, meaning that their sexes separate, male and female on different plants. It is an annual plant. Occasionally, in some locales, it can overwinter. And it's in the Cannabaceae family along with hops. This is how cannabis has been depicted in a variety of ancient languages. I'll just highlight a couple. Cannabis is the direct descendant in our language, and that's from Greek, and you'll notice that there is an accent on the first syllable. Another one of interest is the Chinese kanji. This is a pictographic language, and you will recognize stalks of hemp upside down drying in a shed. And that will be recognized anywhere in China. This is taken from an article on history. This is available to you along with any of the other historical articles at ethanrusso.org at the library tab. In the search engine there, if you put in history, you'll see a variety of different articles. This is looking at Eurasia primarily, but also Africa, and just indicating 38 examples of earlier uses of cannabis. These are discussed in detail in the cited article here, but we'll be giving like examples today. This is a new reference. Excavations in Valencia, which is near Sevilla in Spain, of this woman in question who was said to be, quote, the most socially prominent person of the Iberian Copper Age. She was called the Ivory Lady, and that was almost 5,000 years before the present. Why we're including this is, if you look at the arrow, there was a large ceramic plate that had traces of wine and cannabis on it. And currently, this would be the first, what would we say, non-fiber use of cannabis that we know of in Europe. A little later in Spain, in the 12th century, this is from Sheshet Benveniste, who was a physician. This is written with Hebrew script because he was a Sephardic Jew. And he describes taking hemp in a combination with a bunch of other botanicals. And this was used for a variety of things. Uh, as it states, strengthening sexual desire, curing sterility, repairing all ailments of the womb and the stomach and the head. And it was nicknamed the head shield. Later in Spain, another Sephardic Jew, in service to Portugal, went to India. He wrote the first description in a modern European language, that being Portuguese, of the uses of cannabis in India. A couple of quotes. The profit from its use is for the man to be beside himself and to be raised above all cares and anxieties, and it makes some break into a foolish laugh. So this is quite reminiscent of the kinds of effects we associate with cannabis today. Those of my servants who took it, unknown to me, said it made them so as to not feel work, to be very happy, and to have a craving for food. Again, very typical THC associated kind of effect. So, for his troubles, when it was discovered that he was of Jewish ancestry, his bones were disinterred and burned as part of the Inquisition. But he was redeemed, and this is a statue in Lisbon of him outside the public health ministry, I believe it is. Now we're going to go hither and yon around the world in space and time. This is a depiction of the legendary Emperor Shen Nung about 5,000 years ago, and this is oral tradition. This isn't written. But he was someone that was said to have described medical use of 365 different herbs, which just so happens to be the number of days of the year in the Western calendar. In describing cannabis, Mafen is accurate and balanced. Taking much of it may make one behold ghosts. This is the Chinese description of hallucinations, and frenetically run about. Protracted taking may enable one to communicate with the spirit light and make the body light. It mainly supplements the center and boosts the qi. Protracted taking may make one fat, strong, and never senile. So it's particularly that last bit that really piqued my interest. But we have similar lofty claims from India, where clearly there's been a long, long tradition of cannabis usage. A document called the Anandakanda from the year 1200 suggested strong neuroprotective effects, but this was part of a very difficult regimen uh, that included religious practice and celibacy. Dash translated the passage as saying, "It is claimed that the man lives 300 years free from any disease and sign of old age." So people have to decide for themselves whether they want to live 300 years as a celibate. Um, this is a document that was written in Persian for the Mughal emperors in India called the Mahsan al-Adviya. It is said that bhang, which is another name for cannabis, is one of the best of God's gifts. It is a cordial, a bile absorber, and an appetizer, and its moderate use prolongs life. It quickens the fancy, deepens thought, and sharpens judgment. So, as opposed to modern pejorative spins on cannabis that it impairs cognition, this says otherwise, but also suggests life extension. In more modern times, when Indian hemp had been brought to England in the 19th century, So John Russell Reynolds was the physician to Queen Victoria, who we see depicted here. Um, he described a case study in what was called senile insomnia with wandering, what we would call sunsetting today, where a person with dementia becomes particularly disoriented at night. So this was an elderly person. He talks about brain softening and delirium. Um, and anyway, goes on to give quite a description of his difficulties, uh, being quite rational during the day, but getting lost at night. Um, and then goes on to say, I have found nothing comparable in utility to a moderate dose of Indian hemp, 1/4 to 1/3 of a grain of the extract given at bedtime. It has been absolutely successful for months and indeed years without an increase in the dose. So, as a treatment for dementia and the agitation that comes about with that, particularly at night, this was his recommendation. Well, what do we know from modern times? Certainly, this is something that many people are using for their family members who suffer from similar problems. Um, our friend Jeffrey Hergenrather, um, among other things, works at a California nursing home where they've extensively used cannabis to great advantage. This has been with a variety of different preparations. Uh, THC predominant, anywhere from 2.5 to 30 milligrams a dose. CBD predominant, also including THCA, mainly in tinctures and in edibles. They describe marked benefit in reducing the need for neuroleptics like haloperidol, which actually increase morbidity and mortality in demented people. Also decreased agitation, better appetite, less aggression, better sleep, better mood, also marked decrease in nursing care demands, and additionally pain control. There's more detail on this in the article that you see cited, and in the files available to you, there will be links to all these articles, as well as, if I was the author, at ethanrusso.org at the library tab. Now, how could cannabis help symptom management in Alzheimer's disease? Well, if we look at the different target symptoms, agitation, anxiety, psychotic behavior, insomnia and restlessness, and loss of appetite, there are various cannabis components that may address these and reduce the symptom burden. And you see these listed here. Um, Certainly aggression is markedly reduced according to the anecdotal information, and any of these components, THC, CBD, or linalool, may be of benefit. For depressed mood, again, low doses of THC and certainly limonene is well tested in this regard, and we'll have more detail on that in the components lecture. Pain is quite obvious, particularly combinations of THC and CBD are the best studied in this area. Additionally, there have been claims of memory improvement with cannabis regimens, and certainly this would be likely if there's the inclusion of alpha-pinene, which increases acetylcholine, the memory molecule in the brain. Then there is also the prospect of neuroprotection. Both CBD and THC have been proven in various basic science tests to reduce brain damage, and hopefully this would be the case in this instance. This would be an example of the kind of profile of a cannabis plant that might be very good in such a context. What we see on the right is a report form called the Phytofacts that was developed by Mark Lewis at NAPRO Research. I like this one because on one page, it combines a breakdown of all the cannabinoids with their concentrations and proportions, as you see in the top two rows. And then at the bottom, a lovely depiction of the terpenoid profile. This one is very rich in alpha-pinene, as previously mentioned. This is an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor and will increase the amount of acetylcholine in the brain, which tends to counteract short-term memory impairment, particularly that induced by THC. In the row above, you see another feature of the phytofacts in describing the aroma and flavor if this were ingested, and what people report when taking this. And this one has a strong component of focus. Um, so basically, this is a type 2 agent. It is a combination of a lower amount of THC as compared to a higher amount of CBD. And so this would be a very good prospective chemovar to employ in this situation. Now, switching back to ancient evidence, this is from the Akkadian culture in what was ancient Assyria, current day Iraq. So one of their names for cannabis was a Zulu. This is employed for staying the menses with mint and saffron and beer. Now, we see similar claims throughout the ages. Um, Also, gynecological use in ancient Egypt from the hieroglyphics, what was called shemshemet. Shemshemet, ground in honey, introduced into her vagina. This is a contraction. Well, this could mean a lot of things, but let's examine additional evidence that may shed light on this. Um, Although this is controversial, many of us believe that cannabis was in the Bible as cannabosum. That means aromatic cane, and it's quite close to the modern Hebrew cannabos, um, which is used in later times. So that's mentioned in Exodus. Um, and the passages, and the Lord spoke to Moses saying, and you take your choice spices, 500 weight wild myrrh and aromatic cinnamon, half of that 250 weight, and aromatic cane, cannabosum, 250 weight, and cassia 500 weight by the shekel of the sanctuary, and olive oil a hin. And you shall make of it an oil for sacred anointing, a perfumer's compound, perfumer's work, sacred anointing oil it shall become. Um, Robert Alter, who did a translation of the 5 books of Moses, also said it could be rendered as fragrant stock. Besides the anointing oil, the ancient Hebrews also burned as incense, I'm sorry. Its use was reserved to the priestly class, and Kana without the bosom is also mentioned in several other Bible passages that you see here. It may be that this was suppressed because it was also used in other Middle Eastern cultures. Now, we do have archaeological evidence of the same. This came from a few years ago. As you see in the middle pane, these are limestone altars from a shrine in fortress mound called Tel Arad. Um, and this seems to be analogous to the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. There were depressions on top of the altars that seemed to contain black organic material. From the larger one, there were residues of frankincense, while the smaller one seemed to contain phytocannabinoid residues. And you see the analysis on the right. This included some delta 9 THC, CBN, cannabinol, which is a non enzymatic oxidative breakdown product of THC, which is quite resistant to heat and aging. And there was also some CBD and beta caryophyllene. Their feeling was that this represented hashish that would have been burned on top of the altar, and there were no plant parts per se. We know that the making of hashish was done in other cultures in the Middle East from ancient times. So this may be the earliest physical evidence of psychoactive cannabis usage in the ancient Near East, although there are older references in written documents. Subsequently, in the Babylonian Talmud, again corresponding to modern Iraq, this is in the early centuries of the Common Era. The part of the Talmud called the Kalayim Tractate had laws on agriculture. One of the ones that was mentioned is that you shouldn't grow like crops together in the field. And the specific prohibition was against hemp, cannabis with grapevines. So mixing of fabrics was forbidden, but grapevines weren't used as fiber. So it most likely is that this prohibition was due to use of both crops as psychoactive substances, the grapes for wine and cannabis for its intoxicating effects. Again, physical evidence from Judea at that time. This is from the 4th century of the Common Era. And we've shown this slide previously in another module, but in a different context. So again, this is a carbonized fragment was found in the tomb of a young girl estimated to be 14 years of age, who seemingly died in the midst of childbirth, being unable to deliver a full-term fetus. In the material was found delta-8 THC, which is a more stable compound from cannabis that is impervious to heat. And the supposition is that this cannabis was burned in an effort to stimulate labor, which in this instance was unsuccessful. But this would closely mirror the other ancient claims from Egypt and the Middle East about the ability of cannabis to increase contractions in terminal labor. More modern evidence, again from the 19th century in England. Alexander Christensen was a famous doctor of the age. He said, Indian hemp appears to possess a remarkable power of increasing the force of uterine contraction during labor. This was also contained in many other articles and obstetrics and gynecology books of the age. Bringing it over to North America, Morris Fishbein was the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association for many years. In 1930, he wrote this article on the effects of alcohol and cannabis during labor. Quote, hence, a woman in labor may have a more or less painless labor. As far as is known, a baby born of a mother intoxicated with cannabis will not be abnormal in any way. This is just a listing of cannabis indications in obstetrics and gynecology. We will have a separate module on this. Additionally, you will find an article on the subject in the library, as previously mentioned. Going back to the Near East, this is a medical book from Crocodilopolis. This is from the late 2nd century of the Common Era, and this was written in Coptic, which was Greek-based language of the era. In the book, there are some 30 mentions of meshi, which you can see depicted in the Greek as cannabis and in English as cannabis. There was many of the mentions related to treatment of tumors. We see a few of these listed here. Advancing up to the 11th century in the Old English herbarium, speaks of rubbing hemp with fat, lay it on the breast, it will disperse the swelling. If there is a gathering of diseased matter, it will purge it. From about the same time, 13th century, this is a depiction of cannabis. The Latin description describes cannabis mixed into an ointment and again rubbed on the breast to reduce swelling and pain. Subsequently, Leonhard Fuchs, who may have been the first to use the Latin binomial of Cannabis sativa, talked about hemp root boiled in water and wrapped is also good for gout. The raw root pounded and wrapped is good for the burn. The wild hemp boiled and wrapped alleviates and splits the tumor. This is a popular belief in the Renaissance era throughout Europe. Um, Keep in mind that this would have been European hemp, which would have had cannabidiol if it was heated, but cannabidiolic acid if not. To quote, the seed and the green leaves crushed and applied in the form of cataplasm to painful tumors appears to be strongly resolutive and intoxicating. From modern evidence, one of the first good studies on cannabis effects on tumors, this with cannabidiol, and you can see the marked difference in the tumor volume on the control is compared to the CBD treated. And up to modern times, Ferrugi et al. Reported on a couple of children who had what are called pilocytic astrocytomas. After surgery, both families deigned to give their children cannabis to prevent recurrence, which was quite successful, as you see in the serial scans. I had occasion some years after this to meet Dr. Ferrugi, and he indicated at that time, which was several years later, that the remissions had continued with this treatment. We now know that many astrocytic lines, including glioblastoma multiforme, are uniquely sensitive to cannabinoid treatment. Switching back to ancient Central Asia, this is a study in which I was engaged somewhere in the years before 2008. This tomb had been discovered of what was presumed to be a shaman. He had likely died in the mountains, but had his bones brought to this area. And there were two receptacles containing what was obviously cannabis, over 700 grams of this. It was assumed he was a shaman because of the special goods there, musical instruments, archery kits, and other goods that would be associated with a special individual. This material was reported as cannabis in the first publication, but it had not been chemically analyzed. So we did this with colleagues at GW Pharmaceuticals. Interestingly, there were sessile glandular trichomes that were still visible on this material after 2,700 years. So much so that even the secretory cells of the trichome are visible here. There were seeds. I always get asked if we tried to germinate these, but of course that was unsuccessful. This is what the material looked like grossly, obviously cannabis. But the biochemical analysis was of particular interest for showing cannabinol, again, non-enzymatic oxidative breakdown product of THC, along with cannabidiolcine, another metabolite of THC. There was no evidence that this culture, called the Gouche, used cannabis for clothing. No textile uses have been associated. They did make clothing of other fibers. Between that and this finding, it was clear that this was used medically or ritually as an intoxicant. The material was so well preserved that we decided to do a DNA analysis on it. This showed tetrahydrocannabinolic acid synthase, which the enzyme that makes THC. Additionally, there were some single nucleotide polymorphisms, mutations, if you will, in the genetic code that had never been previously reported in cannabis. It would be very interesting to look at cannabis from that region in modern times and see if these SNPs are still present. Back to ancient China in the 2nd century, and we have a depiction of this story here of this fellow getting surgery done on his arm while playing Go. But in this document from the French literature in the 19th century, referring to 2nd century events, he gave to the sick person a preparation of hemp, mayo, and in a few moments he became so insensible that it were as if he was plunged into rapture of loss of life. Then, following this instance, he practiced some overtures, incisions, amputations, and removed the cause of the malady. He then repaired the tissue with suture points and applied liniments. Reportedly, Watteau survived this. We have no record of who won the game of Go. Back to Europe, Linnaeus, of course, known in Sweden as Carolus von Linné, described cannabis in his book on Materia Medica, Narcotica, Fantastica, Dementans, Anodina, and Repellens. So, having a narcotic effect for sleep, producing visions, loss of memory, reducing pain, and repellents may refer to insect repellent properties. In the 19th century and early 20th century, cannabis was a mainstream medicine in the United States, and here's the proof. This was Park Davis, which until modern times was a pharmaceutical company in this country. And you see the third ingredient was cannabis. So this is a fascinating preparation in that it combined morphine, cannabis, and capsicum, capsaicin from chili peppers. So we have 3 of the major ingredients from plants that affect pain: a phytoopioid, a phytocannabinoid, and a phytovanilloid, all in one preparation. Of course, this would affect the 3 known endogenous systems that mediate pain: the endorphin and enkephalin system, the endocannabinoid system, and the vanilloid system. For all we know, this might have provided better outpatient pain relief than anything we have in the modern day. This is a fascinating book that was published in the 70s called Cannabis and Culture, and there was a chapter on Brazil. Talking about an infusion of cannabis leaves to relieve rheumatism, joint problems, female troubles, colic, and other complaints. And referring to the local anesthetic effect of cannabis, for toothache, marijuana is frequently packed into and around the aching tooth and left for a period of time, during which it supposedly performs an analgesic function. We know that there are various substances that would exert such benefits. And in modern times, this is an older article looking at various randomized controlled trials of cannabinoids in pain. It remains the case today that the vast majority of these were done with Sativex, an oromucosal preparation primarily consisting of THC and CBD. It's interesting to point out that Sativex, or nabiximols, the US adopted name, greatly exceeds the number of patient years of exposure in randomized controlled trials to anything that's been done with any other cannabis preparation. Switching to another subject, Thomas Short in the Medicina Britannica in the 18th century, I once ordered only the hemp alone. Some pretend the following a great secret against pissing the bed. You won't see such language in modern books. Similarly, from Scotland, noted use of hemp seed emulsion in milk useful for heat of the urine, incontinence of urine, and restraining venereal appetites. In modern times, Sativex was utilized for bladder dysfunction. This is in 21 patients with multiple sclerosis. Uh, this is only done after patients had failed other prescription medicines that did not help with the bladder problems. This is an open label study over 8 weeks. And there were significant improvements in the number of incontinence episodes per day, the number of voids at night, nocturia, number of frequency episodes per day, and the number of planned or normal voids. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of follow-up to this. It remains an area that would be valuable to examine. Of course, one of the main uses, the approved use of Sativex or nabiximols in 30 countries is for treatment of spasticity and multiple sclerosis. Well, this benefit may have been described 1500 years ago. This is from what is now Syria. Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Shaq al-Kindi was commemorated with this stamp, who said, quote, hashish eases the muscles of the limbs and what flows. Now, this might mean various things, but my suspicion is muscle relaxation. In the 19th century, William B. O'Shaughnessy was the man most responsible for bringing the knowledge of Indian hemp to Europe and North America. So he tried Indian hemp in 3 cases of tetanus, all of whom survived. One later succumbed to gangrene after refusing an amputation. What happened with this dosing was relaxation of the paroxysms of spasms, allowing people to eat and drink until they would recover, sometimes weeks later. The toxin in tetanus is very tenacious, and if one can get the person through the initial episodes, it will eventually remit. I should point out that it's not a surprise that this was a uniformly fatal disorder before this treatment became available with cannabis. What we know about how it works is on this slide. And this is taken again from one of my articles. What we see on the left is the pivotal trial of Sativex, what was called a randomized withdrawal trial in treatment of spasticity. Unbeknownst to people, everyone got Sativex for a month. There was a reduction in the numerical rating scale of spasticity from 7 to 4, at which point people were resupplied with medicine. Half were randomized to remain on the same number of sprays of nabiximols a day for their spasticity, and half were randomized to go to a placebo. And you see the marked difference subsequently, and this is what led to the approval of the medicine. How this works, we know that muscle tone is under tonic control of the endocannabinoid system. THC or other CB1 agonists reduce spasticity, while antagonists like SR141716A make it worse. The CB1 receptors are densely represented in the various areas of the brain and spinal cord that mediate muscle tone. And in the spinal cord, that's interneurons, etc. As seen here, of course, cannabis-based medicines are clinically effective in spasticity and likely other, in MS and likely other causes. Back to France in the Renaissance era. This is the famous author Francois Rabelais. If you want to cure a burn, no matter whether it be from boiling water or burning wood, just rub on raw pentagrulion, which is a nickname for hemp, just as it comes out of the earth without doing anything else. But be careful to change the dressing when you see it drying out on the wound. Now, how might this help? We know that both THC and CBD reduce neuropathic pain. Being European hemp, this is more likely CBD with no significant THC. We know that CBD is a TRPV1 receptor agonist, like capsaicin. And these various substances are anti-inflammatory, and the corresponding acids in the raw plant are as well. We know that THC and CBD can produce opiate sparing. If there's caryophyllene present, it's a CB2 agonist and would have antifibrotic effects that could reduce scarring associated with burns. I think that this is a very promising technology for the future with likelihood of improved survival. I would also add at this point that pioneering work by Andera Pharmaceuticals, they have developed a foam dressing that combines nanoparticles of silver with very low concentrations of cannabichromene and cannabigerol that shows a remarkable antibiotic effect in wound, particularly with MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, but also gram-negative organisms. Bernhard Frunmuller did a huge study of cannabis and its effects on sleep. Quote, of all anesthetics ever proposed, Indian hemp is the one which produced a narcotism most closely resembling the natural sleep without causing any extraordinary excitement of the vessels or any particular suspension of secretions, or without fear of a dangerous reaction and consecutive paralysis. Otherwise, they were using things like morphine or extracts of opioids. So this is from 1860. He studied this over a period of years and was able to say that in 1,000 patients with sleep disturbance, Indian hemp produced cures in 53%, partial cure in 21.5%, little or no effects in 25.5%. Certainly, almost every study done of medicinal use of cannabis has shown benefit on sleep parameters. Marshall was the first to describe oral mucosal use of cannabis extracts, so that would be absorption in the mouth. He produced an extract of cannabis resin, used it underneath the tongue sublingually, noticed the onset of effects at 45 minutes with an obvious intoxication, offset at 2.5 hours, and recovery at 3 hours. And this is basically the same mechanism by which Sativex spray was used subsequently. And this is a depiction from an older article combining the various studies that were done in different conditions, spasticity in MS, pain in MS, neuropathic pain of a peripheral nature, etc. And you see the marked differences between placebo and Sativex on sleep quality as judged by the patients. If we extended this to more modern studies, I'm sure that you would see similar benefits. Back to Persia in the 9th century, Sabur ibn Sahl described an intranasal base preparation of juice from cannabis flowers that were mixed with other herbs to treat migraine, calm uterine pains, prevent miscarriage, and preserve fetuses in the mother's abdomen. Now, this has a number of interesting features. So the juice in the nose, presumably this was acid cannabinoids with terpenoids. In migraine, because of the vomiting, often oral medicines are impractical or ineffective, but this would be a parenteral type of preparation. You've previously heard how cannabis increased contractions in labor, but interestingly, there's an opposite effect in early pregnancy to reduce premature contractions. So it can be useful for both, as the literature attests. Hildegard von Bingen was probably the most brilliant woman of her age in the 12th century. She was an abbess and a musician. Her music remains available today, and also an herbalist of note. She said of cannabis, whoever has an empty brain and head pains may eat it, and the head pains will be reduced. Though he who is healthy and full of brain shall not be harmed by it. He who has an empty brain shall be caused pain by indulging in hemp. A healthy head and a full brain will not be harmed. I'm not sure how you tell the difference today, but again, we've had a long thread through the ages of benefit of cannabis in headaches. This was first observed in more modern times after O'Shaughnessy brought Indian hemp to England. Clendenning that same year experimented in a variety of contexts. He had great success in treating migraine in 3 cases with cannabis, including one who had morphine withdrawal symptoms. Quote, in my hands, its exhibition has usually and with remarkably few substantial exceptions been followed by manifest effects as a soporific or hypnotic and conciliating sleep. Back to our friend Sir John Russell Reynolds on migraine in 1890, after decades of using it in his patients, he said, quote, Indian hemp, when pure and administered carefully, is one of the most valuable medicines we possess. Also, quote, migraine. Very many victims of this malady have for years kept their suffering in abeyance by taking hemp at the moment of threatening or onset of the attack. It is an unusual medicine that's both good acutely and also produces prophylactic effects in migraine. Very interestingly, although cannabis was very commonly used in the 19th century, we don't see mentions of abuse. In 1902, this book was on addiction, what they called narcomanias at that time. The only mention of cannabis was not in relation to abuse of it, but rather in its benefit on treating other addictions. Quote, cannabis indica can often be used with very good effect in treating morphinism, especially for the temporary removal of the worst symptoms. Sir William Osler is felt to be the father of modern medicine, said of migraine, cannabis indica is probably the most satisfactory remedy. Seguin recommends a prolonged course of the drug. And this was present in what was the main medical textbook of the age, Principles and Practice of Medicine. From modern evidence, this is from Colorado in 2016, an observational trial. 120 adults with migraine who were referred to a cannabis clinic who seemed to need preventive treatment. 2/3 had used cannabis previously, and in the cohort, there was a reduction in attacks of headache from 10.4 to 4.6 per month, which was highly statistically significant. The vast majority had decreased migraine frequency. Almost 40% reported positive effects in preventing or reducing headache frequency or aborting headache. Um, we have to issue the caveat that this was a selected, uncontrolled population. They were using different preparations that were presumably high THC cannabis. There were no controls, but there has just been another study in a preprint out of California that indicates benefit as well, and hopefully that will be published soon. Back to Sumeria, again, ancient area of what's now Iraq, um, referring to Azala, and one ingredient of this preparation, cannabis. These 7 drugs are a cataplasm for the hand of ghost with which to bind his temples. So That sounds a little mysterious, but in 1990, scholars identified Handa's ghost as nocturnal epilepsy. So this may be the first reference more than 4,000 years ago of cannabis as an anti-epileptic drug. We have other evidence from the Middle East. 1100 described, Al-Mayusi described the intranasal administration of cannabis leaf juice to treat epilepsy. So this is quite analogous to what we heard from Sabur ibn Sahl in earlier centuries. Back to William O'Shaughnessy. Case of infantile convulsions in a 40-day-old infant. They use very high doses of a tincture of Indian hemp to control the spells and without producing sleep itself. After 20 days, quote, the child is now in the enjoyment of robust health and has regained her natural plump and happy appearance. Well, that's only one case report. But subsequently in the United States, a very long article on medical use of cannabis in the States. There was success in treating pediatric seizures, 3 or 4 cases of chronic epilepsy in adults. In modern times, Epidiolex, which is a 97% pure CBD preparation, was used in this clinical trial, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2017. So a randomized controlled trial in 120 patients with Dravet syndrome and extremely severe epilepsy syndrome with developmental delay in children. Dose was Epidiolex cannabidiol 20 milligrams per kilogram per day compared to placebo. There was a drop in seizure frequency from 12.4 to 5.9 attacks in Epidiolex patients compared to 14.9 to 14.1 in controls. So that was highly statistically significant. 43% of the patients receiving Epidiolex had a 50% or more seizure reduction versus 27% for placebo. And 5% of the CBD patients were seizure-free and none on placebo. The global impression of change by caregivers improved, also statistically significant on CBD. And this is just one example of many studies of this type. Epidiolex is now FDA approved as of 2018 in the United States and is available in many developed areas of the world. So after all this evidence, why did cannabis disappear for many decades? Well, there are a variety of reasons. The 19th century extracts were not standardized either to composition or dosing. Quality control is impractical and notoriously variable. The original material had to get by ship from India to England or the United States until it was grown locally. They never identified the active ingredient. It was not until 1964 that THC was positively identified. So they never knew the biochemical basis of the pharmacology. Smoking and oral administration in earlier times both had problems. There were safety issues, of course. The main reason, of course, is politics intruded into medicine. In 1937, cannabis was rendered illegal, prohibited in the United States, and that policy was exported around the world. Over time, black market cannabis became THC predominant with a lower therapeutic index, less or no cannabidiol or other agents of the plant that could buffer the THC effect. In modern times, the standard of proof are double-blind randomized controlled trials. That's the only way to get a drug approved. So that's the end of today's lecture. I hope this was enjoyable and instructive.
Thank you so much. That was outstanding as always, and it's very clear by your presentation that history has truly informed the way that we utilize cannabis today. So, a couple of questions. You didn't mention anything about, or I don't think you did, about deaths associated with cannabis use. Did you find that in your research?
Well, it's a very hard thing to demonstrate in truth. Um, I've seen some reports. Mainly it has been a claim of exclusion. What I mean by that is there have been some coroners who have attributed unexplained deaths to cannabis just because they didn't find anything else. However, it's well known that even young people can be subject to sudden cardiac arrest in rare instances. So I think we need better proof of that. I will state that although I've studied this now for 28 years, I can only identify two cases where we can say that cannabis caused someone to die. And this was in the context of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome that we'll be talking about in another lecture. And there were two patients that died from this, but related to extreme vomiting, leading to hyponatremia that led to the deaths. This may sound glib, but this is documented. There has been at least one case of a person who died while being raided by the police who tried to swallow a bag of cannabis uh, to escape detection. Um,
That
so,
is indeed glib.
yeah, well, I'm not making it up and I'm not happy about it.
Right, as no one should be. So the cannabis that was available in historical times would be probably somewhat different, if not largely different, to what is available in more modern times, and might be different from geographical location to a different geographical location. Can you address that?
Sure. So, if we look historically, if we're talking about Renaissance times in Europe, this would have been hemp. It would have had been CBD predominant, but in a low concentration. We see that there were a number of uses of this raw, which would indicate cannabidiolic acid, something that requires a lot more study, and we'll be talking about this in more detail. The material from India was from Bengal, and this would have been THC predominant, but likely rich in other components as well. Um, Again, in until recent times, for many decades, the material available in the United States would have been THC to the exclusion of everything else, and selective breeding went in that direction. In other areas of the world, such as Morocco, Afghanistan, the material would have been THC and CBD in 1-to-1 ratio. And certainly this was the basis of the material that was used in England that led to the selection of Sativex as a 1-to-1 mixture. And there are many advantages of that has been proven in the literature over time. So your point is well taken. Um, Cannabis isn't one thing. It's a very variable chemical factory. So we always need to take account of what's in the material. To some extent, historically, we can infer what it was about. It's harder to infer dosages, although we have ideas. The humans haven't changed that much. So we still have a good idea of little being good and more sometimes being deleterious. Anyway, again, I think there are plenty of examples of where we should concentrate our focus on how this stuff may be beneficial in a variety of conditions.
So the cannabinoid CBN has been popularized recently in the United States as a sleep aid. And I know that you are not on board with that. Um, and I also noticed that in at least two of the examples that you provided in historical cannabis samples, CBN was present in a small to modest amount. And will you address why that is, and talk a little bit about CBN in general?
Sure. So again, you'll find this in old cannabis or degraded cannabis, because it's what happens to THC when it's too old. Um, CBN does have some medical applications. It is quite weak as a CB1 agonist in comparison to THC. Why are we seeing this in modern usage? Well, I think that it's a convenient way for companies that have too much old cannabis that they couldn't sell to use it. So it's become popular as a sleep aid. However, there's no foundation to this scientifically. There was an excellent review article by Karun a couple of years ago that looked at all of the evidence of CBN in sleep disturbance, and there's just no signal there. There has been one more recent study that I'm not going to cite by name because I think it's unreliable. And specifically, uh, one dose size of CBN seemed to help sleep as compared to all the others that did not. And I think it's a statistical fluke. There are better things to treat sleep with cannabis-based medicine, and I don't think CBN is the answer.
Thank you. So, in terms of going forward, specifically in relationship to gynecological applications in children, how do you see that we should be taking some of what we've learned from the historical uses of cannabis and starting to research it for new modern applications?
Sure. Well, we'll go into this in much greater detail in other presentations, but uh, certainly it's evident in the older literature in the 19th century that cannabis preparations were freely used in children. There was no controversy about it, and it was quite successfully employed. And there were very few problems. One reason being that children under the age of 10 are highly resistant to the intoxicating effects of THC. I'd also point out that in medicine, I'm not aware of any drug developed in adults that hasn't found application in pediatrics at some stage. So when a child has a serious disorder that warrants cannabis-based treatment, it should be done. We now have one cannabis-based medicine, Epidiolex, which is used in children, and nobody's getting too excited, but the myths continue, uh, like THC is somehow going to be the scourge of youth. It's a medicine. It should be used properly, but has application. The same would be true in obstetrics and gynecology. Some of the most common usages of cannabis-based medicine in the 19th century and early 20th century, as we've seen, have been in OBGYN. Um, since there's no teratogenic effect, no induction of birth defects, this is something we need to get over and start judiciously applying cannabis-based medicines to these issues because they've been ignored.
Thank you. Is it true that Queen Elizabeth utilized cannabis?
Um, Queen Victoria,
Queen Victoria, I'm sorry.
sure. Sure. Um, uh, no, first of all, the royal family doesn't share their medical records. We've seen modern evidence of that. Um, it is true that Reynolds was the court physician to Queen Victoria. However, by the time he gained that position, it's likely that Queen Victoria was postmenopausal. We know from what we've heard that she had period pains and also had migraines. We don't know specifically that she was treated with cannabis. You'll hear that claim. It's not proven. I've had this discussion with eminent historians in United Kingdom, and they agree with me. So we'll never know. But it is the case that her trusted physician was a big proponent of cannabis usage.
Thank you. And we'll never know if Queen Elizabeth used it, but that could be fun to know about too.
Bet.
All right. And final question. This one's just for fun. So, of all the people that you have researched, which cannabis physician in history would you most like to have been able to have met and why?
Well, I'm lucky to say that I probably met the best, and that was Raphael Mechoulam. As part of the course offerings, I hope that my tribute to him will be available as one of the lectures. Beyond that, it'd be hard for me to choose. Um, Reynolds would be one. I would like to meet the suburb and Saul. There are many choices.
Nice. Well, thank you so much. This was an excellent presentation to each of our viewers. Thank you. We look forward to seeing you in the next module.
Thank you.